Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Shaw, and welcome to the 14th day of our series, The Catechism of the Orthodox Faith According to the Old Testament. Today, I want to wind up our discussion of key elements of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, the Torah, by reviewing the Israelite sacrificial system. This system comes into play, of course, in understanding the New Testament and understanding Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and continues to play a role in understanding the divine liturgy. Before I begin, though, I want to make a couple of comments about yesterday's presentation, where I explained the system of blood taboos or uncleanness that existed in the Old Testament, and how those have continued in Orthodox practice. Now, there's with some negative reactions to my reporting this. I'm simply reporting what exists. I'm not making any personal theological comments on the perpetuation of ritual impurity into a Christian system. Some people object to this on Pauline grounds, others object to it on a variety of grounds. For instance, that it makes young girls feel like there's something wrong with their bodies if they're told at the time of as they begin their menses, that they now they cannot receive communion on those periods and so forth. But one element that seems to never be dispensed with, which is technically part of the whole system, is that, for instance, it's universally accepted, I think, that it would be improper to have sexual intercourse, legal sexual intercourse with one's own wife on the morning before one intends to go to church and receive Holy Communion. And why is this? Is it because sexual intercourse that's been blessed in a marriage is somehow improper or sinful? No, this is an example in itself of ritual impurity. So even if we got rid of, and as has happened in many places where the rules about menstruation or the 40 days after birth or various other aspects of this system were to be dispensed with, I don't think the system can be entirely dispensed with in normal Orthodox practice. So that's what I'm going to say on that subject today. It's something that is very controversial. Many voices in the church object to these practices, while others support them. I'm not going to get involved in these controversies here. I put up on the Facebook page a few articles attached in the comments to yesterday's presentation for those who want to read further on the topic. So the Israelite sacrificial system. Now there's various ways we could go about discussing this, a very complicated subject. I've divided into 5 things: sacrificed, how they were sacrificed, when they were sacrificed, the kinds of sacrifices they are, and then lastly, the atonement is kind of the pinnacle of this system. So what things are sacrificed? Well, they're cattle, and sometimes it's specified it's a young bull. There's, different kinds of male, female, old, young, these kinds of specifications can come into play with any of the animals. So they're cattle, sheep, and goats. And birds. Birds are often substituted, that the poor person can't, doesn't have a sheep or a goat to sacrifice. And that's a big thing. So they have to sacrifice. They substitute a bird or 2 birds sometimes for the sacrifice. A grain, oil, frankincense, and wine. And grain is in the specific offering called the grain offering. The grain is mixed with oil and incense. It can be offered as is, uncooked, or can be cooked in various ways. And all this is gone into detail in Leviticus. And then how is the sacrifice done? What is the procedure? Well, the person who's sacrificing brings their sacrifice to the door, where beyond which only priests are allowed. We discussed the architecture of the temple the other day. And the person sacrificed lays his hand on the victim. Now, this conveys some kind of identity, some kind of passage. Let's say if you're, but these aren't detailed. What it all means is not detailed. We have to kind of guess what things mean. So it's generally considered by scholars that when you put the hand on the animal, that the animal is somehow now identified with you, and what happens to the animal is happening to you. So the hands are laid. In the case, of course, an animal, it's killed. And then the blood, remember we read yesterday a lot about the blood, that the blood is sometimes sprinkled, it's thrown against the sides of the altar, it's poured in the altar, and mixed with the ashes. A fire is built on top. So ultimately, the blood is either poured around and or sprinkled around, and ultimately it's most of it is consumed by fire. And then the animal parts itself are burned, either all of them, in the case of a whole burnt offering. Because what happens is, of course, a butchering takes place. The animal is blood is taken out of the animal, and then the animal is skinned. It's cut into quarters, and in a whole burnt offering, it's all burnt. In other offerings, where parts are given to the priests or part is given back to the person who gave the offering, it's the part, only some parts are burned, and those parts are especially the skin and fat. So fat and blood are considered things that shouldn't be eaten. Although fat doesn't come in for as strong of prohibitions as blood does, it is mentioned that the children of Israel shouldn't eat fat, interestingly enough. So bloody, fatty steaks are not really part of the scheme here. So it's burned, parts are perhaps eaten or given to the priest to be eaten later. And there's also an action called waving. In the case of wine, there's the pouring out of the wine. Waving means that that let's say on Pentecost we discuss that leavened bread is offered. So these loaves of leavened bread are waved over the altar. They're not burnt in it. Other things have been burnt. The smoke is rising, and these are waved so as to not destroy them. So when are these sacrifices offered? Well, they're offered every day to begin with, especially the whole burnt offering and the grain offering are offered every day, because these are general and types of offerings and aren't applicable to individual circumstances, although individuals can offer them too for whatever reason. And why people would offer one offering over another is often unclear. And so there is another reason is Thanksgiving. Something good's happened. And in this case, this is where this Thanksgiving offering is also called the peace offering, and we have a reference to this in the Divine Liturgy, where we sing an offering of peace. This is a peace offering. So the Eucharist takes on aspects of the peace offering. Why? And peace offering is also called a communion offering, because the people receive back part of the sacrifice and they share it. I think these, from what I understand, these meals were eaten on the temple grounds. So let's say you go with your family or Thanksgiving, you bring your goat, things happen somewhere. At the end of the process, you get back the goat to be prepared. It's a lot of these, the practical details aren't clear, but to be consumed in Thanksgiving at the temple. They're also offered for voluntary and involuntary sin. So involuntary sin includes ritual impurity. So in some cases, the scriptures define that if a person has had contact with the dead or some other kind of ritual impurity, a certain kind of sacrifice needs to be offered. And then there's the firstborn of the animals. So any male animal that's the firstborn of the animals is brought to the temple to be given to God, sacrificed to God. And there's also, and this is the system of child sacrifice we've mentioned, the firstborn male. Well, it says very clearly in Exodus that the firstborn male belongs to the Lord and needs to be given back to the Lord. In one instance, it doesn't say anything about redeeming the firstborn male, which is perhaps left over from the child sacrificial system of the Judahite kings, which we'll discuss when we get into the history of those kings, where they would sacrifice their firstborn male son for some reason. Because remember, through a lot of this period, Jerusalem is an island in the Syrian Ocean, and they were under constant threat. So under these dire circumstances, human sacrifice seemed to be warranted. But in most instances, the rest of the instances in the scriptures, it says that an animal is substituted to redeem this firstborn male that belongs to the Lord. In some instances, there is also provided for the payment in cash to redeem the firstborn male. And this, among Orthodox Jews, this continues that a firstborn male must be redeemed. A priest, a Kohen, must be identified and must be paid the appropriate amount of money to redeem the firstborn male. Now, the kinds in Leviticus, the opening chapters of Leviticus, details 5 kinds of sacrifice. And these are the burnt offering, often called the whole burnt offering because the whole animal is consumed. The grain offering, which we've mentioned, where grain and oil and incense, probably to make it burn better, is offered. And part is put there on the altar to be burned. The rest goes to the priests. The Thanksgiving offering, the offering of peace, or the communion offering we've talked about. For involuntary sin, there's one offering for involuntary sin, another for a guilt offering. Now, the guilt offering is for some pretty specific circumstances. They involve the use of oaths, using the name of God in an oath, of where one has, let's say, accidentally or done something that requires restitution to someone, that the restitution has to be paid, an offering has to be made to God. So there's the guilt offering often involves a restitution element. You can read the details of this in the first, I think, 6 or 7 chapters of Leviticus. Gets into the whole system here. But all of these elements are then brought into play on the sacrifice par excellence, the sacrifice of atonement on the 10th day of the 7th month. Now, theoreticians try to answer why these things were done, and our answer is they were done because all these things are types of Christ in some way or another, and these themes are brought together in the epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, showing how the old sacrificial system was a type of Christ, particularly the atonement. Now, the atonement had many of these sacrifices kind of woven together into it, but it had, for instance, the high priest had to do sacrifices to purify himself. The purification sacrifice is also called the involuntary sin sacrifice. So he had to purify himself and ready himself personally, not only through sacrifice, but through bathing in a ritual bath, which is an important element as well in the system of the temple. But finally, the high point of the atonement is, as we mentioned, the two goats. One goat, and the two goats being twinned in a way represent one goat, so that double action could take place. Because I mentioned that the architecture of the temple, is not only is a pattern in the sky, but the symbolism that is put onto the sky makes the sky a template for the organization of the entire earth, with the Holy of Holies in the center. So what needs to happen here is that the sin that's been accumulated during the year, even though it's been expiated by this system of sacrifice during the course of the year, there may be things that have slipped by. So the whole thing, everything needs to be brought back to square one. Everything needs to be brought into complete harmony on this day. So this is a day when all sins are redeemed. So one of the goats, the goat for Azazel, is driven into the wilderness with the red ribbon around its neck, or string around its neck, signifying the sins. And before it's driven, the anointed priest, the high priest, puts his hand on this goat and recites the sins of the people of the year. Perhaps there are, important things that happen that need to be discussed. So he names the sins, and the goat is sent off into the wilderness. And the scripture doesn't get into much more detail than that, but we do have more detail in the Talmud that, based on oral recollections going back to those times. The other goat, the goat for Hashem, for the divine name, for the Lord, is then sacrificed. And the blood is collected from this goat, and this blood, in a very similar fashion, is what happens when the high priest, the anointed high priest, has to do an involuntary sin offering. In that case, he takes the blood and he goes and he sprinkles in the direction of the veil that separates the holy place from the holiest place. He sprinkles 7 times with this. But in the atonement, he takes the blood, but not only of the goat, but of a bull. There's another whole element here. It's a very complicated service with many changes of vestments and so forth. And one of the ways, just footnoting my footnote, that the Romans controlled the Judeans in the first century was by controlling these vestments, the vestments that the anointed high priest had to use in order to conduct the atonement. So they would keep them under lock and key. in order to ensure that the priesthood stayed in lockstep with the Roman administration. And you can learn about these details if you read Josephus. So he goes into the Holy of Holies with a big shovel full of incense. We mentioned there's no light in there. Somehow he sees by the glory of God, and he sprinkles the mercy seat with this blood, thereby re-sanctifying the temple. It's a rededication of the temple. The sins have been carried off into the desert, and the blood has been brought before God in the holiest place. So the entire spectrum of the universe is encompassed in the actions of the Day of Atonement, bringing everything into a state of harmony, of a new beginning, and this is why it was probably the original New Year. There's get into this, and when we discuss calendars again a little bit, that for Jerusalem, whereas the Passover was the New Year in the Northern Kingdom, it's probable that this rite was the trumpets, atonement, tabernacle sequence was the beginning of the New Year in the Southern Kingdom in Jerusalem. So this is I've gone very, very quickly and briefly over the whole system of sacrifices in Israel and in the Jerusalem temple. One thing to keep in mind with the atonement is this particular rite was specified exactly for the Jerusalem temple. It wasn't something that happened elsewhere because of the relationship between Jerusalem and the wilderness. So sending the goat, the scapegoat as it's sometimes called, out into the wilderness is something very specific to Jerusalem and the rites there. So understanding this background, it's helpful for us to understand the book of Hebrews, because in the book of Hebrews, the epistle, I should say, to the Hebrews in the New Testament, if you'll read through that, you'll find that he discusses all of these details. He also brings in another important system of the red heifer, which we don't have time to get into today, another part of the sacrificial system. But mainly he talks about atonement and about how Christ presents his blood into the heavenly temple, into the prototype of the earthly temple. And this is on his, presumably on his ascension into heaven. So that is our presentation for today. We're closing out the Torah, and tomorrow we'll begin looking at some of the history and background to the book of Psalms, and start reading in the Psalms, picking up our thread of the theophany and how the theophany becomes related to the King of Judah. And particularly, we'll be looking at the royal Psalms over the next little while. So thank you very much. We've done 2 weeks, so got a few more to go, but we're steaming right along. Thank you very much.